Hello, sorry for the delay there, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Navatar's Nick Donato. I'll be your moderator, and today we're doing something pretty fun. I'm going to shoot for a rough estimate here, maybe 2,000 private equity, real estate, and venture capital managers out there looking for cash. It's a big number. And so with all that competition, it's crucial to know where fundraising best practices have gone since the boom years. Here at Navatar, we can help you essentially manage your LP relationships. We can simplify your workflows and just generally speaking here, make life easier at the firm by utilizing smart technology. But when it comes to fundraising, we're going to defer to the experts in the field. So today we have Jen Hutter and Liz Weiner of KAP Group. Now, KAP Group was started in 2009 to do two primary things. One, shorten the amount of time it takes to fundraise, and two, show GPs how they can build better, more longer-lasting relationship with investors. Now, Jen and Liz will provide you the specifics in just a moment, but allow me to quickly say that as we go through these new rules for fundraising, many of them I would describe as mandatory in today's market. We do welcome your questions. Just use the GoToMeeting widget tool there to the right on your screen. And also, we will make sure to email everyone here a recording of today's webinar tomorrow, sans the initial delay. So look for that in your inbox. Jen and Liz, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll resurface after the presentation to relay some audience questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you to Navatar again for hosting this webinar today. My name is Jen, and I'll kick things off for us today. So before we begin, I'll give you a brief overview of what we'll cover today. So we're going to present for about 25 minutes. We are going to then leave time for Q&A after the presentation. We'll begin by introducing you to the KAP's fundraising flywheel philosophy, and then we are going to take a deep dive into 3 of our 5 flywheel principles. So with that, let's get started. So, much like Nick was just saying, let's set the stage for what the market looks like today. As of Q1 2016, over 1,000 private equity managers and nearly 500 real estate funds are raising capital. Now, as you can see by looking at the chart, this number is increasing year after year. So the competition is getting more and more fierce, and investors at the same time are culling their portfolios, keeping fewer relationships, and so relationships are really crucial to securing your slot with investors and really standing out in this context. So if you look at an investor's pipeline, a real estate investor reviews 155 funds on average and invests in only 3. So as you can see, this is an incredibly small percentage of managers that are actually getting allocations. And just as a side note, KAP works with both private equity and real estate managers. So you'll see a mix of this data throughout the presentation, but numbers aside, the trends really hold true for both cohorts. So let's take a look now at how investors are actually meeting managers. So we just mentioned that investors are decreasing the number of managers that they're holding in their portfolio, which means that relationships are more important than ever. So if you look at this chart here, what's fascinating is overwhelmingly investors are meeting managers, A, through their internal investment team, but secondly, through peer recommendations. Almost 49% of all commitments are sourced through peers, which is really an astounding number and something that we find our managers don't focus enough on, is really thinking about who your partner's referrals might be. So we're going through relationships, how much relationships matter, but the other piece of managing your relationships is trying to shorten your fundraising cycles. So let's take a look now at how long managers spend on the road. So we all know that managers spend an incredible amount of time on the road raising capital. If you look at the chart on the left, you'll see that over 50% of managers are spending well over a year on the road. And if you look at the chart on the right, you'll see that the number of months on the road by real estate managers is increasing substantially from 2007 to Q1 2016. So the one thing to keep in mind when looking at this data, it's already scary enough, but if you factor in that 66% of total capital raised went to the 10 largest real estate funds, these numbers are even worse. So, for example, Blackstone did not spend 18 months on the road raising capital for a vehicle. So 18 months, scary as it is actually on the low end of reality for most funds.
Thanks, Jen. So when Jen and I started the business, we really observed our managers going through the same pattern of fundraising. They would fundraise, they would fatigue, and they would have to repeat. And the process from our perspective was tiresome, inefficient, and highly ineffective. So when we started KAP, we really tried to figure out how can we shorten this fundraising cycle for our clients, and how do we eliminate this phenomenon of having to start from square one every time you need to do a new raise. We've observed this so much that we sort of said this must be the definition of insanity. We see clients doing this again and again and expecting a different result, and it's just not changing. So we came up with an alternative approach to help our managers spend more time on investing, create better long-term relationships with partners, and shorten those fundraising cycles. And the outcome of those efforts was this fundraising flywheel, which really is our illustrative way of showing the continuity between your fundraising process and then investor relations. So your fundraising really needs to flow through to the way that you interact with your clients and prospects in between fundraisers. So the flywheel has 5 elements. The first is outlining your communications plan. What are you going to say? Who are you going to say it to? And when are you going to say it? The second is marketing when not marketing. So how do you stay in touch with prospects in between raises? And how do you keep your brand and what you do in front of those folks? How do you do that through a thoughtful long-term capital raising strategy? So whom are you going to go see, and when are you going to go see them? And then when you go see them, what are you going to say to them? How do you create impactful marketing materials that are appropriate for the meeting that you're about to have? And then finally, we help our clients make all of those meetings count. So making sure that your message comes across loud and clear in each meeting, and that the conversation is one that leads to logical follow-up. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jen to talk about the communications plan.
Great, and we're going to talk in depth here about 3 of the first points of the flywheel. So the first element is outlining your communications plan. And there are a couple of main points to this element. One is to thank your partners the old-fashioned way. Pick up the phone, write them a note, thank them. They're actually in this partnership with you. It's a two-way street. And similarly, in this conversation, let them know when they can expect to hear from you during the year. We think that setting expectations at the outset is incredibly important for your partners, and it also allows you to build a culture of transparency. And then the last piece is determining logical touch points with prospective investors, and we're going to continue to dig into that through this element. So the first piece is, with whom should you keep in touch? So we've just talked about partners, we've talked a little bit about prospects, and we've talked about referrals. And so from our perspective, these are the three categories of investors that you should be focused on in your not only your non-marketing period, but in your marketing period as well, and we'll go through that in a bit. So the first piece here, so let's look at the communication timeline. And this is what a general communication should look like with your investors over the course of the year. And obviously this is through the normal course of business. How do we deliver good news? How do we think about speaking to our prospects? So if you look at the timeline, there are a couple of touch points with your partners that everybody does. Hopefully you're saying thank you and setting expectations. You're sending out quarterly and annual reports at an agreed upon schedule, and that's great. But there are also a couple of other points here that are worth noting. So one is deal announcements. And that is, from our perspective, something that goes not only to your partners, but also to referrals and to prospects. And in a deal, when we say deal announcement, we do not mean at all to send your investment committee memo. You really need to send something that's impactful, that actually will get read by investors. So when we think about a one-page deal announcement, we're thinking about, here's how we source the deal, here's what our underwriting and returns look like, and here's how we plan to add value as a manager. And what this does from an investor's perspective, particularly one that it does not know you yet or is not investing with you, it helps them understand how you think about operating your business, and it helps them understand how you behave as a fiduciary. Similarly, we think that it is important and completely appropriate to invite these prospects to your annual meeting. Let them see who your investors are. Let them see how you communicate annually with your investors, and let them see what you're thinking about the market. So this level of transparency, we think, is incredibly important and helps you to continue to build and foster these relationships, no matter whether you're marketing or not, in your marketing or non-marketing period. So before we leave here, as I mentioned, this communication timeline is really about good news. But what do we do with bad news? And we get asked all the time, you know, this happened, it wasn't too bad, do I have to tell my partners, can I not tell them, what can I get away with? And from our perspective, it's very simple. Depending on how bad it is, you either pick up the phone or you get on an airplane. It is so much better for an investor to hear bad news from you than from somebody else or from their Google News feed. So 100% be transparent, get on the phone, get on an airplane. We have a great example of when to get on an airplane, and that is in 2009 when the world really fell apart. We heard from one of our consultants that from a large real estate consultant, that only one of his 100+ managers actually got on a plane and went in to share with him exactly the losses that they anticipated on their portfolio. And he went on and on about how this was such a great example of being a good fiduciary, and that despite the losses, they would likely invest with this person again. So yes, if your portfolio suffers a material loss, get on a plane and communicate this with your partners. They expect that things are going to go wrong, and they expect that you will be the one to communicate that with them.
And this brings us to the market when not marketing element of the flywheel. So before we dig into what do you say to investors and how do you think about this aspect of your branding efforts, we wanted to give you a quick snapshot of what an investor's mind looks like. And we do this because we often have conversations with our clients who very much take for granted what their investors know or don't know about their portfolio. And a lot of times our counsel is they don't know that much, and we created this graphic to illustrate why that is the case. Investors are really busy. This just shows an investor who has invested with 2 fund managers, each with multiple funds and each with multiple constituent assets in all of their portfolios. There is no way that the investor in her smart suit on the left knows what's happening in the upper left-hand store icon of Joe Fund Manager's portfolio. There's just no way. And we illustrate this to show you 2 things. One, how difficult it is to add just one more manager with more funds and more assets to a portfolio. From the perspective of the investor, you really have to articulate why they need to do that and what are you bringing to the table. And then 2, we also wanted to highlight how important it is to reinforce the message of your value proposition and why you are the right addition to their portfolio in a given moment in time. And from our perspective, the most important time to do this is in between fundraisers. So what are the elements of the marketing when not marketing piece? We really bring the goals of this fundraising, of this effort really is to build loyalty among your existing investors. So the conversations you have with your LPs on a regular basis, outside of the quarterly meetings, outside of your annual letters, and outside of these announcements is really to strengthen and reinforce and bolster that relationship as a good partner. The second is to cultivate new relationships for subsequent raises, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on when we touch on the capital raising strategies. This is also an effort that will make asking for those referrals and for the investors to become your champions in a way much more fluid, easy, and sort of it becomes an easier ask. So we want to make sure that you sort of maintain that relationship. And then the final aspect of this marketing when not marketing element is probably the most difficult to fit into your daily routine, which is really aim to meet with 2 to 4 new investors per quarter. And those can be aspirational kind of goals, but you really need to think about who are the new folks that you need to start building those relationships with, because that relationship building effort really does take a lot of time.
And one thing I'll add here, Liz, is, back in 2005, 6, 7, it really was difficult to get in the door with the new investor. In today's world, investors really do have an open door policy, and we hear from investors time and again, they want to get to know you. They are not, after a 30-minute meeting, going to sign a check over for $30 million. This is a process. It's a long process. It's a dating process. Think about it that way. So meeting with these guys during your non-marketing period is not a hard ask, and I think you'll find 9 times out of 10 investors are more than willing to meet with you and get to know you in this period.
So now we'll get into a very, very high-level overview of what should your materials address when you meet with these investors. And we'll just caveat at this juncture that we can do an entire webinar just on a pitch book. But here, what we're going to do is really hone in on the really critical elements for these conversations. So we start with the top 3 factors that investors consider when investing with a manager. So not surprisingly, they are the length of your track record. So how long have you been doing this? Secondly is, how well have you done it? What does the past performance look like? And third, what is your strategy? And strategy is one of those complicated things that we could also do a separate webinar on, but really what investors want to know is that you have a consistent, proven approach. And it's sort of, we always talk about it as kind of rinse and repeat. You've really implemented a strategy successfully. You've done it successfully across cycles, and it's really a proven approach to achieving the superior returns. The second part of this developing a non-marketing presentation is a very high-level overview of what should you say. So we want to make sure, and how should you say it. So on the screen on the right side of the slide, we really highlight the top 3 things. 1, make sure it's impactful. We cannot tell you how many decks come across our email. Thank God we have 1 terabyte of storage plus that are 50-page decks that no one in their right mind can get through. So first of all, when we say make an impactful presentation, we really are saying kind of say what you need to say in as few slides as possible. We also want to make sure that your presentation not just addresses how well you invest investors' capital, but how well you manage it, how well you perform as a steward of capital and as a fiduciary. It is so important to understand that investors want to make sure that you not only do a good job in your chosen strategy, but that you're able to manage their capital well. And so we talk with our investors a lot about showing gross to net returns. What does that scrape mean? And really articulating to your prospective investors, how is that capital deployed efficiently to get them the maximal net return. And then finally, and this is one of those areas that that our clients try to be not as transparent about it as they could be, which is, when are you going to need capital? What is your pace of deploying your fund? When do you think you're going to need capital? What does that look like? How are you looking to change or maintain your investor base? Do you think you're going to have a lot of re-ups of your existing investors? Are you looking to expand your investor base? Are you looking to change your mix? Be as transparent here as possible. Investors appreciate that because they're not just partners with you, but they're partners with their other LPs. So we always encourage our clients to make sure that that element of the presentation is addressed. And then finally, be ready to give this pitch in 30 minutes or less, which is always the hardest part. And 30 minutes is not a hard, fast rule, but we say that because you just want to be as succinct as possible so that you can move on to an organic conversation where you can start to feel each other out as prospective partners. You think about the world the same way. Don't, in as much as possible, and it's ironic to say that in a webinar, try to avoid making this a monologue in as much as possible.
Absolutely, and the one other piece on the presentation, we are not sticklers about you have to stick to every single slide. The important thing is understanding what your main points are, and that's what putting a deck helps you do. It helps you really flesh out what those points are. You absolutely can go off of your presentation, but you need to make sure that you've made the points that you want to make in every meeting. And a concise, impactful presentation will allow you to do that.
And one more tactical piece of advice on the presentation part, whether you're fundraising or whether you're marketing when you're non-marketing, send the presentation in advance so an investor has a sense of
Absolutely.
what you're going to say and how the conversation will go. It will make the meeting much more fluid. And now I'll hand it over to Jen for the capital raising strategy.
Great. So this is the third element of our flywheel. It's the last element that we'll review today. But for us, the capital raising strategy really bridges the investor relations and the fundraising elements of the flywheel. And there are two critical components to this phase for us. One is identifying prospects, which is always on the top of every manager's mind. And two is leveraging technology. And we're going to talk a little bit about how KAP leverages technology for this purpose for our clients. So let's take a look at how to find the right prospect. And we're bringing this chart back because it is so important, it is so impactful, and time again, managers fail to ask their partners for referrals, which, as you know, we've mentioned that several times today. That's obviously, we think, a really, really important way to continue to generate leads. But the other piece is, so you are going to meet with your managers, you're asking for referrals. The other piece is very simple, and it's just following the news each day. We all get inundated every morning with stories from our industry newsletters talking about such and such investor made this allocation, such and such investor, is now thinking about this, is thinking about JVs, is moving away from funds, whatever the case may be. That is an incredible source of information, and from our perspective, you really need to be leveraging that information, not only for when you're meeting with investors. We strongly encourage our clients, and we make sure that when our clients go into a meeting, they have as much background on an investor as possible. It's not the time to ask them, what are you up to? It's really a time to go and show that you've done your research, you know what they're doing, and you think why, and then you can present why you might think you might be a good fit for their portfolio. But the other piece is capturing this information really allows you to start to catalog and seek out what prospects might make sense. So I'm going to show you here on our next slide what we do. So at KAP, we leverage the Navatar system in two different ways. We track investor activity, as I just described, and this is obviously news articles. You can pull things down from different databases into the Navatar system so you have everything in one place. And then also it's a way to catalog your dialogue with investors. And a lot of managers have a couple of different touch points within their organization. It's really important to understand what investor is asking what questions. Are there trends there? Are there things that you can address better? And making sure that your CFO is not calling to answer the same question that one of your investment professionals is calling to answer. So really, again, just being really thoughtful about the relationship and figuring out how to catalog that information we think is really, really important. And the last piece I'll say is, what's shown here on the screen is a snapshot from our Navatar system, which shows CalSTRS, their specific allocation to real estate funds. And then if you scrolled around the screen, in our world, you would see all of the different times that CalSTRS have been in the news in the last 12 to 18 months and get a better sense of what they're doing with their portfolio. So once you have this system in place, the last piece from our perspective is really implementing this capital raising strategy. And this is so important. We cannot stress this enough, because what we see are managers going into the market and becoming incredibly reactive. They go see a very long shot consultant, let's say, and then they spend 2 weeks putting together the consultant's materials, and the process, as you can tell, just sort of snowballs from there. You want to be, we completely understand that this is an inefficient process, but you want to be as proactive as possible in your capital raising strategy to change that for the better for you. So here's how we do it for our clients. We set up the capital raising strategy in 3 different tiers. Tier A, the first 30 to 90 days, is you are focused 100% on your high probable first close prospects. This is not a huge list of investors. This is 3, 5, 10 investors. They know you already. Either they are existing investors or you have gotten to know them very well in the non-marketing period, and they've indicated a very strong interest. You're negotiating the term sheet with your lead investors, and you're really setting the stage for the rest of your fundraise. So Tier A, the first 30 to 90 days from our perspective are critical. This is where you build momentum. This is where you really see just the kind of legs your fundraise actually has. So 90 days, so you're 90 days in now, and you're negotiating a term sheet. You are very close to actually having a first close. Maybe you have a strong circle. That's fine. As long as all of those investors have what they need and they're in process, then let's move on to Tier B. And Tier B are probable prospects. Maybe some of them are existing investors, some of them you've met along the way, some of them are referrals, but you have a good relationship. And the way to know this is just how does it feel to you to call them? If you have done your job, communicated effectively, and built the relationship, this should not feel like a strange call in the least. And the way that we think about Tier B is, these meetings are much more impactful if you can say you have Tier A behind you. And again, this is where we see managers slip up all the time. There is this anxiety, managers are very anxious to get on the road to continue to meet with people, and you absolutely want to do that, but you've got to do it thoughtfully. Otherwise, again, it becomes a very reactive process. And with Tier B, we also think it's really important to show momentum. We think about this as maybe smaller, 5, 10, 15, $20 million investors. They're probably not going to be your leads. They're looking to know that somebody else has kind of taken that on and negotiated the term sheet, not really on their behalf, but certainly in a favorable way for LPs. So being really thoughtful about separating those 2 cohorts are very important. And then lastly, Tier C, this to us is those sort of big goals that, they are very unlikely to come into this fund, but they're important to meet with. So when I think about Tier C, I think about, you've been wanting to go see Townsend or Cortland or Cliffwater, and the opportunity really hasn't presented itself. Maybe you met somebody in the non-marketing period who uses one of those consultants. Absolutely, go and see them, get to know them. They may not make it into this raise, and that's okay. But at least at that point, you start to build their relationship, you understand their process, and you don't spend the first 30 to 90 days filling out their questionnaire for something that is going to be unlikely for this raise.
And just to add to this, one thing that we also always counsel our clients on is when investors come into your raise, you're almost not closing with any new names. So when somebody comes into your raise, a new name is somebody who was referred to you by an investor who's tracked you for a long time. That's really a new investor. But it's very hard in the context of a raise to sort of meet somebody who's never met you before and then get them closed within a fundraise. It's really somebody who you have some link to in some way, be it from your former marketing efforts or someone who knows you from the industry and from their fellow investors. But these Tier C guys are really not for, there's a kind of the cold names who you're just getting a foothold to introduce yourself to. The likelihood of any of these Tier C guys coming into your raise is very low.
Absolutely. And getting personal here for just a moment, we think about this like dating. And I will throw my story out on the line for purposes of example, but I dated my husband for 3 years before he proposed. I did not expect him to propose after the first 30 minutes of us knowing each other, and that's exactly the same way with investors. This is a long process. This is not meeting and then I'm going to meet somebody new and I'm going to expect them to close in 3 to 6 months. This is a very long relationship. You are cultivating this. I know we've said this 1,000 ways. Obviously, we feel very, very strongly about it, but we see this all the time. We see some of these pitfalls, and we think that planning your raise in manageable stages is really a great way to approach your capital raise. So this concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. I'll turn this back to Nick momentarily for our Q&A, but before I do that, Liz and I would like to thank Nick and Cindy and all of the Navatar team for their assistance and for hosting this great event for us today. And thank you to all of our participants. Thank you so much for your patience in our technical difficulties. And we look forward to your questions. Back to you, Nick.
Well, thank you for all the great insights. We have a few questions coming in, the first being from James in California. How many follow-ups would you say is acceptable if you have a non-responsive investor, or I guess using that dating analogy, if you're not getting your call returned or your text returned, are you allowed to follow up?
Because they're just not that into you.
They're just not that into you.
Well, you shouldn't be texting investors, first and foremost. And I don't know, Nick, if you translated that, but let us just be clear, you know, engaging with investors is a pretty old-fashioned process, so you absolutely can email them, you absolutely can call them. I would say texting kind of gets into very stocky behavior, so I wouldn't text them.
But I think your question, Nick, was actually about follow-up and how many times,
right,
how many follow-up efforts are actually, and again, I would go back to the dating. I mean, if somebody doesn't call you back, they probably are not interested, and that's okay. That's why in our communication plan we outline, you know, it's okay to send them an acquisition or a disposition memo to invite them to your annual meeting. If after a couple of years you get absolutely no response, then you know you need to revisit. If this investor has said to you, you know, we're either not investing in real estate or we're not investing in private equity or we don't do that particular strategy, you know, that's something to certainly take to heart. But that's why we like to build in these touch points, because they're not personal touch points. They're not you calling and calling and calling. They're really impactful ways of just saying, hey, I'm just keeping you apprised of my progress. And at some point down the line, it'll make sense to make that call again.
So we have Serena in California asking, what is a good target number for slides in a marketing pitch? I'm sure you've seen a wide spectrum of clients that you've helped fundraise. Is there a precise number that tends to work best during these meetings?
You know, there's not a precise number. We think about this between kind of 5 to 7 slides at the beginning of the presentation, and what we're actually doing is putting more and more in the appendix. And what that actually does is it allows you to have certain detailed slides in your book, but it does not make it so that you have to go through, you know, and this is just an example, so please don't take this as this is our advice, but, you know, sometimes, for example, the process slide, the more detailed track record slide, the bios, obviously the end notes for the track record, there are sometimes more in-depth marketing charts. Some of that can go into the appendix. So maybe 5 to 7 is a little aggressive, but 8 to 10, just sort of depending on the manager, that's really the way that we think about it for our clients.
Good to know. A third question from Greg in Vancouver. What do you think about cold calls or cold emails? Is it ever acceptable strategy for meeting new LPs?
Absolutely. I mean, part of what I just talked about with kind of aggregating news is really understanding the marketplace. And, you know, investors really do have an open door policy. We've really found that, you know, from our perspective, we don't actually make calls on behalf of our investors. We're not a placement agent. So there are plenty of times where we say to one of our managers, we think that these 5 or 6 folks would be a really great option for you. Give them a call. I don't think cold calling is bad at all. We think that finding a link is obviously, you know, a better way to go about it. But if you don't have that, we think a cold call is fine. And you should also have, which we didn't talk about today, but we certainly talk about a lot, is, you know, a one-page overview of your firm. You don't need to send them your 50-page deck in an intro. They need a one-page snapshot of here's who we are, here's what we're doing. And I think that a call or an email in that way is perfect.
And I think to Jen's point, you know, when you make that cold call, you have that cold email, what you really want to show, what you want to sort of telegraph in some way is why you think you would be a fit for that investor. And you could be completely wrong, but you just want to be thoughtful about, we've seen you do X, Y, or Z. We have an interesting approach to this strategy. Here's why we think it might make sense for us to chat.
Right.
Right. We have a question from Brian in Australia who's going to put you on the hot seat a little bit here. How many of your clients do not go on to raise successful funds? Or if I can even add to that myself, is there any type of pre-screening process before you would take on a new client?
So that's an interesting question. So we've worked with over 45 clients in the last 6.5 years. We work with clients in varying stages. So some of our clients come to us for investor relations, for example, and we will set a systematic approach for them whereby they have the right touch points with new investors, everything that we just described. In terms of our managers that have raised capital, we don't have an example of somebody who didn't successfully raise capital.
The tricky part, Brian, is in what you define as success. I think often a client will come to us and say, there'll be a mismatch between what their objectives are and what the market is ready, the amount of capital the market is ready to commit to them. So a lot of the work that we do with our clients is really make sure that they're better aligned, given on where they are in their life cycle, to sort of have a successful fundraising goal. So if you've never managed capital before, for example, and you want to raise $300 million, that's not a reasonable goal to have a commingled $300 million commingled fund when you've never managed capital before. So what we really define as success for a certain group of managers is if I've had a high net worth capital and I need to get a beachhead with a couple of institutional investors, we've been very successful in helping our clients kind of move them along the spectrum there. When a client comes to us and wants to have, a commingled raise, we work with that client. We help that client achieve that goal based on our assessment of the amount of capital they've managed before and on whose behalf and what type of portfolio of institutional investors they have. So I think it really depends on what stage the manager in and what really is a reasonable expectation of success.
Right, and we give unbiased advice, and we are very frank up front. If we don't think you can raise the capital, we will talk to you about different structures. We don't think that a fund is for everyone. There are JVs, there are separate accounts, there are deal by deal. There's a lot of ways to access capital in the market, and so we make sure that we say that at the outset so that expectations are clear.
Question from Ted. What are your thoughts on conferences, and how do you make them effective? And let's assume that they are effective. He's wondering, what's the best way to follow up with somebody?
So conferences are interesting. I think that, when you decide to attend a conference, you must always get the attendee list and really try to schedule meetings beforehand. Conferences are highly ineffective if you just go to sessions and sort of loiter around in the lobby. You'll have a couple of interesting conversations, but it's very hard to sort of have those meaningful one-on-ones. So we always encourage our clients to have a game plan for a conference and at least have a couple of meetings teed up with folks with prospective investors if they are attending the conference. As a follow-up, an effective follow-up is making sure that you follow up with somebody 24 to 48 hours after you've told them you were going to send them something. So if you meet with somebody at a conference and you told them you're going to send them either market commentary, it's not always a pitch book, by the way. It's sort of
or a
one-pager. Whatever you promise to send them, the most important thing is, one, the timeliness of that response, and secondarily, the actual content that you're sending them.
And just absolutely, and just in terms of the number of conferences each year, I mean, from our perspective, just to give you our own experience, we're very selective about the conferences that we go to. We attend 3 to 4 a year. We obviously, if we wanted to, could spend months on the road going to conferences. There are probably 20 good conferences a year, but we've found the 3 or 4 that are most effective for us, and those are the ones we focus on.
That reminds me, Jen, one interesting story that came up. We were at a conference, we were chatting with an investor, and a manager happened to walk by, and there was, the requisite small talk, and then the manager walked away, and then an investor turned to us and said, "God, I see that guy at every conference." And so one of the things that we want to caution you against is you don't want to be the guy that goes to every conference. Investors do keep track. They know who goes to these things, and, to beat a dead horse dating analogy, if you go to every conference, if you go to every happy hour, investors start to think that maybe you don't have better things to do.
We have time for one final question coming in from Frederick in Chicago. How many people should speak during investor meetings? Is there a target number? And now I've heard from some LPs that when one senior manager does all the talking, it puts them off. What are your two thoughts?
Well, I think it depends which meeting, right? If it's the initial meeting, and this is something we didn't touch on, but from an organizational standpoint, the principals are going to be on the hook for talking to investors for the first 10 years. So, when you think about, obviously there are really additive IR professionals in these organizations as well, and they obviously should be included in this process. But I think when you think about the initial meeting, 1 to 2, we think about it as maybe you have 3 people there, maybe it's 2 principals and the IR professional. That's a manageable number of people for a first meeting. When you move on to a due diligence meeting, and this means the investor's truly interested in getting to know you, you absolutely should have more members of the organization present and have them talk, and have your deal guy, your deal teams talk about your deals, and have your CFO talk about, the administrative processes of the firm. So I think it depends on which meeting.
And at the annual meeting, I think that's what the question was. At the annual meeting, we really encourage that to be the medium by which we really can show off the whole organization. Mm-hmm. So we always tell our clients maybe to have the principals act a little bit like the MC and really sort of make sure that the folks who are on the front line of investing and deploying the capital day to day and who are in the markets day to day have some select speaking roles. That's really important. Because otherwise investors don't really have a way of meeting the broader organization. So that's an excellent format for letting them see, one, kind of how are they deploying the capital day to day, but also to give the investors a view of how you're developing talent and how happy the team is to stay there for the duration of the vehicle these folks are invested in. Absolutely.
So thank you for your questions. Jen, Liz, thanks for sharing all this great information. Our contact information is included there in the final slide, which again will be part of the webinar recording to be emailed to everyone tomorrow. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.